Can you imagine someone cares about the look of their nails so much that they literally handicap the functionality of ceramic artwork? Just cut your nails.
Everything about you. Everything about you.
Hello, you dirty potters. How are you today? Today we're going to talk about different types of pulling methods that I have come across in my ceramic art career. This is going to be more of a supplementation video to go along with the original pulling video I'd given you guys in the final step of the beginner's playlist. There are a ton of different ways to pull, different ways that I have not even come across yet, but in this video, we're going to go across the different ways that I have learned how to pull and that I've come across, and the utility of those different types of pulling. I've seen people pull with their fingertips, which is fairly normal. I've seen people pull with the thumbs of their knuckles. I've seen people pull with their regular knuckles. I've seen people pull with their palms. I've seen people pull with only 2 fingers. I've seen people pull with 1 hand. I've seen a bunch of different pull methods. And usually the people that I come across that are the best at throwing use all of these different pulling techniques in different times of their throwing stages to really optimize how they throw. So today we're just gonna go over a couple of those. Now, the majority of potters learn how to throw with their fingertips, and there's a very important reason for this. Your hand is extremely tactile, and the information that you get from the nerves and the tips of your fingers give your brain and your body a lot of information about what you're touching and how to handle it. One of the main reasons most potters are taught to firstly throw with their fingertips is because you get a lot of information from throwing with your fingertips. This really allows you to feel the thickness of your clay as well as how much pressure you should be putting on your clay as you pull. Now, if you're a true beginner, this is gonna feel a little bit awkward to you at first. The hand positioning, the feel of the clay, and every single type of clay feels different. But you will know exactly how that clay feels based on how your fingertips and your nerves react to that specific type of clay. For example, and I'm sure many people can tell you in the comments below, clay with grog in it feels massively different to clay without grog in it or porcelain. It feels kind of like throwing cream cheese. The high majority of potters learn to throw this way first because it gives you the most information as far as your clay body goes. As far as your fingertips go, I've seen the normal way of people bracing their middle finger in the inner wall of the clay body and then throwing with their hands sideways like this, much like you just saw me do. But I've also seen this way.
Ryan Little.
Did you see how my hand was upside down that time instead of sideways? Sideways, I can at least use 2 different fingers to brace my inside finger and push those walls together, like this. But when my hand is upside down, I have a lot more pressure on the bottom of that little hump that I'm trying to get all the way up to the top. This one, this little hump right here. This is a little section of clay that I've pinched off to pre-designate what I'm going to be pulling to the very top of my cylinder. If I'm pulling like this, it's very easy for me to feel the clay here and also to brace the bottom of that little hump right here. I essentially have 2 different tactile points that gives me a lot of information for my clay body. This upside down trick is a little bit more advanced in that I don't need that extra sensory. I honestly just already know the piece of clay that I'm going to be pushing up, and I want a little bit more pressure right there. This allows me to push in a little bit deeper, and I can bring my hand up a lot faster. Let's move on to knuckle pulling. Knuckle pulling is one of those things that I was amazed to see the first time, because as far as I knew, I only saw people pull in one fashion, either with their fingertips or with a sponge. And admittedly, whenever they use a sponge, they still put the sponge against their fingertips. Knuckle pulling is one of those things that you pull out whenever you need an extreme amount of stability and power. You see, it's a lot easier to stabilize and get a lot more power from your hand when you're just stabilizing this portion of your finger. But this entire finger is a little bit more difficult to stabilize. In my experience, most people that I see knuckle pulling are people who are pulling because they're pulling extra large pieces. I don't too often see people with little tiny pieces pulling with their knuckles, because this is primarily a technique used for extra stability and power, not something you really need with smaller pieces. Gotta move the camera back a little bit. The difference in between knuckle pulling and pulling with your fingertips is that you don't get that same tactile information I was talking about earlier. You don't get the same nerves touching the clay body as you would get with your fingertips. And because of that, it's a little bit more difficult to get a certain amount of information out of your clay body when you are pulling. But the rules of your hand positioning are relatively still the same, with the exception of instead of pulling with your longest finger, you're essentially just going to be pulling with your first digit and knuckling up. You don't really need your second digit at all, but your finger is still braced on the inside of your clay body like normal. Did you see that? Did you see that giant caterpillar of clay that was moving all the way to the top? It was a lot bigger than it would have been if I had been pulling with my fingertips. It's because my knuckle is a little bit bigger than my fingertip, and I'm pushing it at an angle, which kind of traps the clay right above my knuckle. I get a much larger piece of clay, and it's a lot easier for me to stabilize with my wrist and the distance in between my knuckle and my digit right here. The hand positioning differs just a little bit in that instead of pulling like this, where I get a lot more information and I have to be kind of careful with my pressure because all the pressure is divided among my one, maybe even two, fingertips right here. Everything that I'm squeezing is basically right here. But as far as my knuckle goes, it can handle a lot more clay because what I'm pulling is the distance in between here and here. This, of course, is bigger than my actual fingertip. Let's move on to speed pulling. I don't see many people using this specific technique of pulling, but when I do it, I'm usually hump throwing and I'm usually trying to produce something over and over and over again for speed or time's sake. You see this? This is a designated piece of clay that I've decided to throw off of the hump. And this is me essentially pulling with one hand off of that formation. The only difference is, instead of bracing my fingers on the inside in order to pull, my left hand, which would be the hand that I would be bracing on the inside of the clay body, is out here trying to stabilize the clay body. But from the inside, all I need is two little fingers. This was a little tiny cylinder that I just pulled with essentially my thumb and my finger. The tricky part about this way of pulling is that it has to be done extremely fast, as it is usually used for speed of producing things. Here, let's do it one more time and I won't speed up the camera at all. We start from a little cone piece of clay. And there we go, we have a cylinder. You see, look, it's empty on the inside and everything. There are some people that are so fast that they can pull and form at the same time, using basically only their middle finger, their first finger, and their thumb. They essentially just pull out like this while throwing off of the hump. It's less of an advanced technique and more of a production potter technique. This technique is specifically used for making things over and over and over again in quick succession. Usually the same amount of clay is used because, well, if I'm doing this, my hand is only so big, which means that I'm basically pulling the same amount of clay each and every time, unless I'm putting more or less pressure. This is also used as a slight pulling / opening technique, because once I get to this phase, I can easily pull this same cylinder into any shape I want. You see, look, I made a little swirly cup, and it took less than a minute. Let's talk about the final technique, palm pulling. I'm gonna be honest with you here, palm pulling is not a technique that I usually use. And most of the time, whenever I see someone using it, it's usually because they have those long old receptionist lady nails. Palm pulling, for me at least, is not recommended because you can't get a lot of information from your clay by pulling with your fingertips. Because as the name suggests, palm pulling is done primarily with your palm. I'm trying to pull my fingers back so you guys can see. Palm pulling is kind of like knuckle pulling, but to a much greater extent, to the point where you can almost not even feel what's going on inside of your clay. The amount of information you get from your clay body is massively reduced, and the high majority of the time that I see people use this technique, it's because they're first years in pottery class and they don't want to mess up their nails. I hate to break it to you, but you basically just spent $50+ on a fancy handicap. But I have seen one person pull this off. One person learned to proficiently pull like this in order to not mess up their nails. Now there's two different ways you can do this. You can either do it with the part of your palm that rests right below your knuckles, like this, and kind of mess around with the blade of your hand, or you can use the palm that's closest to your wrist. The palm that's closest to your wrist is usually used for much bigger pieces of clay. This is maybe 1 pound to 1.5 pounds. This isn't very large. Palm pulling takes almost all of the tactile information that you would get from your fingertips out of the equation. You're essentially just using raw power from your wrists. And most of this technique requires a lot of power from your forearms and pushing inwards like this as you pull. You see, I still pulled my cylinder, but my fingernails okay, they're relatively clean. My fingernails are virtually untouched by the clay body itself. The only real finger that's touching the clay body is the inside one, in which I need to brace and pinch the clay itself at the very bottom. But my actual fingernails on my operative hand are not really touching the clay body at all. Most people do not pull this way, and in my experience, I have found the people that try and pull this way are just really desperate to not get their nice nails messed up. Well, thank you, Dirty Potters, for joining me today. This was just a short supplementation video to go along with the different types of pulling that I've experienced in my ceramic artwork career. If you've ever seen someone pull a different way than mentioned in this video, please leave it down in the comments below. I would always love to hear your guys' opinions, and it's always super cool to see different ways of pulling. Even if they're out of desperation, like the palm pulling technique, it still cracks me up. If you'd like to see any of my artwork, the links are always down below for your beautiful Potter eyes. And of course, we have the Discord and Facebook community, which you can always join. There's tons of helpful Dirty Potters over there who are always willing to help you with your artwork. You guys have a good day, and I will see you, Dirty Potters, next week. My nails, my pretty nails with sparkles on them. I better relearn an entirely new technique, which will handicap me for the future to save my pretty nails.